How could a single morning cup of coffee bring down an entire system built on years of deception? Have you ever sat in a familiar diner, watching everything operate so seamlessly it nearly fades into the background, only to have a single passing comment shake everything you thought you knew? That morning, Luther Grant stepped into Morningstar Diner, Branch 42, beneath a light drizzle, dressed like a weary long-haul trucker stopping for a break. A worn-out jacket, a low-brimmed cap, and a slight limp were all it took for him to blend into the scenery like any stranger passing through. No one recognized him as the founder of the very restaurant chain once praised as a symbol of fairness and wholehearted service. Luther had spent over 25 years building Morningstar, but his trust in polished managerial reports had distanced him from the truth hidden behind the gleaming tiles and perfectly rehearsed customer smiles. And now he was back, as quiet as a pin dropping in a crowded room. Luther chose the table by the window where the soft golden lights reflected off the polished surface and the foggy glass pane drew shifting patterns of condensation. He hadn't yet placed an order when a young woman appeared beside the table, setting down a steaming cup of black coffee, a slice of toast, and two neatly arranged jam packets. "Black coffee and toast. I added butter and jam just in case," she said, her tone polite, though there was a strange stillness in her eyes. Her name was Nenah. Nothing about her stood out. Hair tied back, apron worn at the shoulders but clean, movements so gentle the plate touched the table without a sound. Luther thanked her, playing the part of a passing traveler. He took a sip of coffee, then casually asked, "Busy morning, I guess? Tips must be decent, right?" A question that sounded offhand, but in truth, it was a key meant to unlock a door. Nenah paused for just half a second, barely noticeable, but enough for him to catch it. "Morning shifts are usually the worst for tips, especially when we have to split them. And not everyone gets a share," she replied in a steady tone, neither bitter nor resentful. She said it as though it were a matter of fact, as if that was simply how the job worked. But to Luther, it struck like a blow to the chest. That one quiet sentence sounded louder than anything he had heard in years. He looked around the diner. Everything was still the same. The espresso machine hissed steadily, customers chatted in soft murmurs, staff moved swiftly with trays of food. But now, it all felt like a stage where the curtain was beginning to part. No one questioned it, no one checked, and that was the most frightening part. A system designed to be fair had evolved into one that favored a select few, quietly obscuring the rest behind roles labeled support, a title that sounded temporary but acted as a silent sentence erasing people like Nenah from recognition. On the surface, Morningstar was still a success story, but in Luther's mind, a hairline crack had just appeared in that polished veneer. A crack not loud or dramatic, but one that spread quickly. And he knew if he didn't trace it all the way to its root, then the entire foundation he once built would one day collapse under the very silence he had mistaken for peace. Luther didn't react right away. He didn't take notes, didn't ask further questions. He simply sat there, wearing the calm expression of a passerby enjoying a quiet morning drizzle and a cup of black coffee that had already begun to cool. But in his mind, every sense was screaming. He hadn't come to scrutinize every move of the staff, but to verify a suspicion that had haunted him for the past 3 months. A single anonymous email, quietly dismissed by regional management, that spoke of a tip-sharing system manipulated by relatives of the branch manager. When Nenah said, "Not everyone gets a share," he knew the first piece of the puzzle had just surfaced. Through the light condensation fogging the window frame, Luther silently observed the staff moving around the diner. A young man named Brent, with neatly combed hair and a spotless uniform, stood near the POS terminal. He only moved occasionally, and never with a serving tray. Beside him was Jace, in his early 30s, arms crossed, occasionally tapping a few buttons on the screen before stepping back as if guarding a privileged post. Neither of them served customers, neither poured coffee. Yet every payment, every transaction, passed through them. Nenah, in contrast, moved constantly, refilling water at table 6, replacing a plate at table 10, wiping a spill on the counter as if she had done it 1,000 times. But not once did she touch the POS terminal. Luther waited until Nenah returned to clear an empty plate to ask a question so soft it seemed to drift past, timed perfectly so she couldn't avoid it. "Why don't you just swipe cards for customers? Inconvenient?" She didn't look at him, but her voice dropped slightly as she replied, "I don't have access. Only those assigned the POS handler role can process transactions." Then she added, almost in a whisper, "I'm categorized as support staff. I don't get digital tips." Luther tilted his head, pretending not to understand. "So who decides who gets that access?" This time she looked up. In her eyes was something that resembled anger held in too long. She glanced subtly toward the back counter where Cullen Voss, the branch manager, was laughing with a regular. Navy blue dress shirt buttoned to the top, a shiny pen clipped to the chest pocket, a relaxed stance, a knowing smile, the kind of man who mastered the art of seeming in control while doing very little. He sets the access permissions, and Jace is his nephew, always on the morning shift, always with full privileges. She didn't need to say more. Luther understood. The POS system he had originally designed was meant to ensure transparency. Whoever served received the tips, with access rights divided according to job roles. But now, it was being twisted into a perfect disguise for privilege, and worse, for injustice to pass as routine. The problem wasn't the software, it was how people had weaponized it. Luther sat there, the coffee in his cup no longer warm, but the blood in his veins beginning to heat. Not from anger, but from a growing clarity. Something was deeply wrong in the structure, and he knew watching wouldn't be enough. Now was the time to act, subtly, precisely. And it would all start with the very people who believed they were the only ones who understood how the game was really played. Luther no longer needed more evidence of wrongdoing, but he kept playing the part of a distant traveler, sipping each bitter mouthful of coffee like medicine, waiting for Nenah to return. When she came back to clear the plate, he spoke gently, almost as if making casual conversation rather than probing. "Sounds like someone's playing by their own rules." Nenah hesitated. Her eyes dropped, then flicked quickly toward the payment counter where Jace leaned against the POS terminal as if it were his personal property. A flicker of conflict passed through her gaze. And then, as if something long buried had finally cracked open, she did something Luther didn't expect. She slipped her hand into her apron pocket and pulled out a small, thin object, its edges worn from use, an old notebook. She said nothing more, just placed it on the table between them and gently pushed it toward him. "I never meant to file a complaint," she said evenly. "I just needed to know I wasn't imagining things, so I started keeping track. For myself." Luther received the notebook as one might cradle something fragile. The paper cover was creased, corners folded over again and again, but inside were rows of meticulous handwriting. Dates, table numbers, receipts, tip amounts displayed, and the amount she actually received, circled in red when they didn't match. In the margins, quick slanted notes marked times, minutes spent at each table, whispers from customers that Nenah had preserved like fragments of living testimony. Luther flipped through a few pages. He had read thousands of financial reports in his life, every line of cost, margin, debt ratio, but he had never seen data that made injustice so clear. There were no exaggerated claims, no accusations spelled out. Only silent numbers, and had no one asked, they would have remained forgotten. Nenah looked down and whispered, as if afraid of her own voice. "I've lost over $600 this past month, but what hurts most is that no one ever asked how tips were divided, or by whom. Everyone just assumed it was fair." Luther closed the notebook gently, like shutting a diary of someone's soul. He said nothing more, but inside him, something had begun to shift. A business can survive low profits. It can endure a few bad reviews. But when the best people begin to believe the system no longer sees them, when those like Nenah are left unrewarded, not for lack of skill, but because they're not the ones who were chosen, then the company is no longer alive, only existing. That morning, in a quiet corner table of Morningstar Diner, Luther finally saw what he had refused to see for months. A system rotting from the inside, concealed beneath a surface of smooth operations. And what made it dangerous wasn't its scale, it was the silence. No complaints, no resistance, no uprising, just people slowly erased from the radar day by day, like Nenah. And today, thanks to a single notebook, one of them had stepped out of the shadows and sparked an investigation that would force the entire system to take a hard look at itself. Luther left Morningstar Diner Branch 42 with slow, steady steps, but his gaze had changed. In his hand, he carried nothing but the photos he had just taken quietly. Each page from Nenah's notebook, each red circle marking something the system had never acknowledged. He said nothing as he walked out, didn't look back. But within him, a plan had already begun to form, quiet, precise, and uncompromising. Back in his car, seated behind the wheel as light rain drizzled across the windshield, he pulled out his phone and dialed a familiar number. "Una, it's me. We've got a problem, and I need you on it, right now." On the other end, Una Wells, head of internal investigations and the woman who had quietly dismantled 3 complex embezzlement cases over the past 4 years, didn't ask a single question. "Understood," she replied simply. She knew that when Luther said the words, "We've got a problem," it was never something small. And so, within the hour, the POS system at Branch 42 was silently switched to audit mode, a hidden function built precisely for moments when someone needed to observe without being seen. On the surface, everything ran as usual. Customers paid, employees tapped, digital tips flowed through the terminal. But from company headquarters, Una and her analytics team saw everything. Who was doing what, logging in under which permissions, how access levels had been set, and most critically, where the tips were actually going. By the next morning, a preliminary report was on Luther's desk. The document was short, but each line sliced deep into the trust he had once placed in his own system. The first revelation stated that the POS system had been modified to include an internal priority access level, one that didn't appear in standard admin interfaces. Only 3 accounts had this level: Cullen Voss, the branch manager, Jace V., a part-time floor server, and a third under the name Kitchen Support 03, with no profile photo, almost no visible activity, yet it routinely received tip payouts. The next finding was worse. In the past 30 days, the branch had received over $4,800 in digital tips. Of that, 67% had gone directly into Jace's account, despite records showing he had served fewer than 15% of the tables. And finally, upon deeper inspection, the Kitchen Support 03 account was tied to an employee ID that didn't exist in HR records. No tax documents, no contract, no onboarding date. Even more concerning, this same ID had once been flagged for overlapping with a suspended file at another branch 2 years ago. The manager at that location, coincidentally, was also Cullen Voss. Then came the final blow delivered by the finance department. A shell company named Larkmont Logistics LLC, registered out of state, had been receiving weekly HR service fees every Friday, amounts that almost exactly matched the discrepancy in lost tip funds. When the LLC's contact information was checked, the registration email belonged to an old Gmail account once used by Cullen Voss before his promotion. Luther set the report down, fury rising in his chest. This was no longer favoritism, no longer oversight. This was a deliberately crafted scheme, using structure to obscure intent, using technical language to legitimize injustice. And Nenah, in silence, with a simple notebook and a few thin pages, had unwittingly exposed not just one location, but an entire web of fraud hiding beneath Morningstar's polished surface. And Luther knew this game was no longer beginning. It was ending. Right where it all had started, a small diner, a lukewarm cup of coffee, and one server assigned to the group no one paid attention to. Friday, 9:06 a.m. The most sensitive moment of the day. The rush hour peak, the dining area packed wall to wall, every movement in the diner operating under high tension, yet still flowing with practiced rhythm. The espresso machine hissed non-stop. The clinking of silverware blended into the hum of rapid conversation. At Morningstar Diner Branch 42, no one had any idea that within moments, that rhythm would be completely shattered. The door opened. Not a man in a faded cap, not a limp fading into the crowd, but a figure standing tall, walking with deliberate, decisive steps, dressed in a sleek ash-gray suit, and wearing the gaze of someone who hadn't come for breakfast. Luther Grant was no longer in disguise. He had arrived as himself. Following closely behind was Una Wells, already holding a tablet set to live audit mode of the POS system. No announcement, no loud noise. Yet in that single moment, it was as if the room had been drained of air. Cullen Voss, leaning casually against the counter, caught mid-laugh with a regular froze mid-sentence. Jace, fingers hovering over the POS screen, stopped cold, his eyes locked forward like a child caught red-handed. The other servers paused as well, not from fear, but because they sensed something far bigger was unfolding, something they had never dared to hope for, yet now stood right before them. Luther didn't waste words. He walked straight to the payment counter, placed his hand on the worn wooden surface next to the POS terminal, the exact spot where Nenah once stood, once watched. "I won't take much of your time," he said, his voice calm, not loud, but resonating through every breath in the room. "I spent 15 years building this company on one principle. Fairness is not a slogan. It is a behavior, repeated every single day." He turned to Yuna. She nodded slightly and tapped the screen. 3 graphs appeared instantly, a breakdown of tips by recipient, an access permissions chart showing unauthorized roles, and a direct payment trace to the shell company, Larkmont Logistics LLC. No one needed to read a word. The images alone chilled the room. Jace opened his mouth to speak, but Luther's glance silenced him before he could form a word. "You received 67% of this month's tips," Luther said to Jace, his tone flat, emotionless. "Not because you worked harder, not because you served better, but because someone handed you a key to a door others didn't even know existed." The room remained silent. No one moved, except Nenah, who, still holding her tray, quietly straightened up, for the first time all morning. Luther didn't raise his voice. He simply looked at Cullen and said with quiet finality, "You are hereby suspended, effective immediately. Your file will be sent to legal for further action. Jace, you as well. Here, we don't have room for those who turn transparency into a personal profit tool." He turned to the rest, his eyes meeting each face, not looking for panic, but for something else. Relief, recognition, release. "If you are someone who actually works, you will be seen. You will be paid. But if anyone has been hiding behind smiles and system loopholes from this point on, there is no place left to hide, no matter how long they've stood behind the POS." There was no applause, no cheers. This was not a movie ending. This was the moment truth was finally called by its name, with every face present, every consequence laid bare. And that was the real beginning. After everything had been said, after names were called out and the system was exposed right there on the floor, Morningstar Diner fell into a strange silence. No more whispers behind the counter, no more avoiding eyes in the narrow cafe. Everyone stood still, surrounded by truth laid bare, and by something no one had dared to imagine, that everything would begin again, starting today. Luther didn't walk away. He didn't turn his back and leave others to untangle the mess. He remained right there, his eyes shifting toward the far corner, where a young man stood pressed against the wall, a damp towel in hand, shirt soaked in sweat, his face hesitant as if silently wondering, "Will I be seen?" "What's your name?" Luther asked, voice low. Ben," the young man replied, almost whispering. Luther nodded. "Ben, today you'll be the first to use the new system." Every eye turned toward him, some with doubt, some with hope. Luther gestured toward the POS terminal, still open in the new interface after Yuna's setup. From this moment on, no more invisible roles, no more secret access. Whoever serves gets recognized. Whether at the counter, running the floor, or pouring water, whatever the work, the system will record it. Ben swallowed hard, then slowly stepped toward the machine. His fingers trembled slightly as he touched the screen. For the first time, he was allowed to log in with his own employee ID. On the interface, there was no more Kitchen Support 03, no more internal priority or supplementary role. The system now reflected the right person, doing the right job, at the right time. Ben confirmed his shift, and the screen lit up in green, displaying the start time and his designated area. The entire diner watched in silence. Then a soft chime rang out, the first order recorded in the new system tied to Ben's ID. That was all, but everyone knew something had changed forever. Una continued tapping. A dashboard appeared on her tablet. Tip flow divided by percentage, each person marked in a unique color. Every action was now transparent down to the detail. Every edited receipt, every voided payment, every tip tracked to a real person. Irregularities from other branches began blinking red on the system's map. A single change, but one that would reach the entire Morningstar chain, not just branch 42. Behind the counter, Jace's employee badge was removed, his access revoked. Cullen Voss exited the office for the last time. No excuses, no resistance. Just one final glance toward the POS terminal, the place he once treated like a personal throne. But power built in the shadows takes only a single light to dissolve. And Nenah, still standing by the counter, watched Ben navigate the system, her hands clasped together but no longer clenched. It wasn't full relief. But for the first time in many months, she no longer had to hide what she knew. No longer needed to write it in a notebook no one would read. She didn't have to say anything, but when her eyes met Luther's, they both understood. A broken system had just been restarted, not with new software, but with a promise kept, that from now on, fairness would no longer be a word printed on a poster. It would be in every touch on that screen, where every person had a name, and every name would be seen. There was no official ceremony, no letter of commendation from the executive board, no red ribbon, no drumroll, no tribute video on the company's internal bulletin. But in the 3 weeks following that morning, word spread from Branch 42 to other Morningstar diners like a quiet yet powerful wave. The transparent tip-sharing model was being rolled out, and the person chosen to lead the training program was none other than Nenah. She didn't stand at a podium, didn't wear a business suit, didn't bring slides. Nenah showed up at each location just as she had always been. Simple shirt, hair tied back, steady gaze, and a way of speaking that was never commanding. She didn't come with a title, only with a story that began with a small notebook tucked into an apron pocket and ended with a system many believed could never be changed, rewritten. At Branch 36, a new employee named Maris, who once thought she was just filling a shift slot, whispered to Nenah after their first session, "It's the first time I've seen my name appear on a tip screen. I thought that was only for people who mattered more." Nenah didn't respond right away. She gently tapped Maris on the shoulder, then quietly pointed to the POS display, where the young woman's name glowed beside a confirmed tip amount. Maris smiled, a small smile, but enough for Nenah to understand she no longer wrote just for herself. At Branch 17, a part-time employee who had quit out of discouragement returned after hearing about the new system. She didn't ask for a raise, didn't inquire about benefits. She simply said, "I don't need to be prioritized. I just want to be counted." That sentence made Nenah pause in the staff break room, her hand resting on the shift schedule, where every shift now had a real employee ID. No more support, no more assistant, no more unnamed roles. Back at headquarters, when Luther received the monthly report with new dashboards, he didn't stop at the revenue figures, even though the overall attrition rate had dropped by 18%. What he circled, underlined, and pinned to his personal board was the final question in the updated internal feedback survey. "Do you feel seen at work?" That question came with no evaluation algorithm, no KPI, no trend line. But to Luther, it was the only metric that could truly save a company from rotting from within. The transformation didn't lie in software or rigid procedures. It came from the people once seen as background, as stand-ins, as support staff. But they, through silence held too long, through handwritten pages no one bothered to read, had become the foundation of a new chapter for Morningstar, a chapter not written by the executives, but by those once forgotten. And Nenah, she didn't need medals, didn't need a title. She walked into each branch just as she used to walk the floor on those mornings when no one called her name. But this time, every eye followed her. Not because she was leading, but because for the first time, they knew they too could stand beside her, be acknowledged, be heard, and most importantly, be called by their name. On a quiet Monday morning, Sunlight touched the weathered window panes of Morningstar Diner Branch 42, the place where everything had once begun. There was no more rain, no more disguises, no more wary glances behind the register. Luther Grant opened the door and stepped in. No announcement, no entourage, no tablet or folders. He wore a simple button-down shirt, sleeves rolled up, and his gaze was calm, like someone returning to an old familiar diner, not to inspect, but simply to feel. The corner table where he had first sat was still there, now bathed in morning light that reflected off the newly varnished wood, no longer hiding old dust, but gleaming as if ready for a new beginning. He sat down and ordered a stack of pancakes and a black coffee. No one recognized him immediately. It didn't matter. He wasn't there to be noticed. The coffee was served, the plate set down neatly, but this time there was no strained silence. The diner was still noisy, but it was the kind of noise that felt right. The hum of coworkers chatting, the steady rhythm of the espresso machine, and from one corner of the counter, Nenah's voice as she guided a group of new employees through how to check their access before each shift. She no longer wore a server's apron. She didn't stand behind the POS. She stood as someone who leads, not by command, not by lecture, but by sharing. Her voice was low and clear, not loud, but strong enough for anyone listening to understand that here she didn't need power. She had experience. She had trust. She had a real story, something no slideshow could ever replace. Luther didn't stay long. Before leaving, he placed a $20 bill beneath the half-finished plate and gently slid a handwritten note under it. His handwriting wasn't ornate, but it was steady and even. Thank you for rewriting what everyone else chose to ignore. Now you are no longer alone, and neither are they. When Nenah returned to clear the table, she found the note. She didn't open it right away. She just looked at it and let out a quiet breath, not out of surprise, but as if the words had already been written in her heart long before. Some messages don't need repeating. They aren't just remembered. They are lived, every day. That evening, in the small room where she used to jot down private notes, Nenah took out the old notebook. Its soft cover had faded. The corners were still bent, the red ink still smudged. But she didn't reread it. She didn't need to. Gently, she removed each page, stacked them neatly, and placed them in a sealed envelope. On the front, in slanted black ink, she wrote, "For the next person, in case you need proof that you are not crazy for noticing what others pretend not to see." She left that envelope on the desk of the new manager, someone just assigned to roll out the transparent tip system at another branch. No further note. No one would know it came from her, and she didn't need them to. The notebook had fulfilled its purpose. Now, the new system would carry the weight. No more gray zones, no more hidden roles. Everyone who clocked in would be called by name, at the right time, in the right way, for exactly what they gave. To Nenah, fairness was never a reward. It was not a favor, and certainly not a policy. It was a promise, carried out daily, even when no one was watching. And for people like her, change didn't come from shouting or rage. It came from not turning away, from continuing to write things down, and from one quiet decision, to no longer let injustice be treated as normal for even one more day. And then, in that stillness, the world began to shift. From a notebook, a name recorded right, and a piece of paper that was never torn. From a leadership perspective, a company doesn't collapse because of declining profits or customer complaints. It falls when its most dedicated people begin to feel invisible. Building a system is one thing, but nurturing trust in the hearts of every employee is the most lasting foundation. If you resonate with the true value of quiet fairness, don't forget to like and subscribe to follow the stories that matter. And what about you? Share your thoughts in the comments with the words "seen and valued," because everyone deserves a clear place in the very story they helped create.